The before and after revolves around the passing of the GDPR. That this is one of those few moments in tech history where legislation actually changes the direction of the industry, at least on one side of the Atlantic. And today we have a whole category of companies that are born with a native appreciation for privacy. We're doing this because it's right and it's good. This is one of the things I'm most proud of, that the European tech scene is starting to diverge. It's not just a poor, cheap copy of Silicon Valley. No, it's a set of companies trying to do something else, fundamentally different. I don't want a cheap copy of Twitter or Facebook or Amazon.
Hello and welcome to the Product People podcast. Here we learn from the most amazing people in the product space for 30 minutes at a time. My name is João Moita, and today we bring you the highlights of a conversation with David Heinemeier Hansson, also known as DHH, hosted by Mirela, the founder of Product People, and recorded live at one of our community events. DHH is the founder of Basecamp and Hey, and he is also the creator of the popular development framework Ruby on Rails. He has extensive experience building tech products and managing internationally distributed teams. He's also the author of several books related to remote work, work-life balance, and agile development. At Product People, our mission is to help companies discover and deliver great products faster. We do that by doing hands-on product management work at companies of all sizes, and also by sharing knowledge generously with our community of more than 20,000 product enthusiasts. To find out more about us and access our community, check our website, getproductpeople.com, or head over to our YouTube, LinkedIn, or Meetup pages. You can find all the links in the episode description. I leave you with Mirela and DHH. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
On your recent blog post, you wrote about principles. What are non-negotiable principles you applied at Basecamp and Hey?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. We were just talking internally recently about why don't we have a mission statement at Basecamp? There's a lot of companies who try to sort of narrow it down and say, like, we're just about these 8 things, or we're just about these 10 things, and that's our core principles and they drive everything. I have a hard time to boil it down like that. And perhaps because we do write as much and we think about having a opinion or take on so many different things, that boiling it down to just a core set of principles is quite difficult. We've written 4 books, and all of these books they're short, but all the points are short too. So Rework, for example, our most popular book that sold more than 500,000 copies, has 86 essays, which are all essentially a form of principles. So to just boil it down to like a handful is difficult, but I'd pick out just one thing that has been sort of a thread going through the 20 years that Jason and I have been running Basecamp and the business together, is this notion of independence. That having and being in a position of independence is both incredibly liberating. It allows us to talk about things in a authentic way where we don't shy away from difficult topics, provocative topics, and hopefully novel and enlightening topics, because we don't have to kind of dress it down or dumb it down or flatten it to appeal to either the widest amount of people you can imagine, or to be careful about pissing off some bosses that we might have, whether those bosses are actual bosses or a board or venture capitalists or someone else who kind of eats a slice of your independence pie. And that level of independence, I think we've really taken upon us as almost an obligation. At Basecamp, we should do things that only we can do because we have this level of independence. That has manifested itself in a variety of different ways. But when we launched Hey.com, for example, and Apple showed up 2 days after we launched and said, hey, we'd like 30% of your revenues if you want to stay on the App Store, that felt like one of those moments where we could take an unreasonable amount of risk to confront this issue of antitrust, confront this issue of big tech, by taking a very large public and high stakes battle with Apple, where if we had been a company of lesser independence, if we had had venture capitalists, or we'd had a board, or we had individual investors, or we were very small, we probably wouldn't have dared because it is difficult to take that kind of decision to go up against the most valuable company in the world and risk a product that you had just spent 2 years and millions of dollars developing on the basis of principles. Because when Apple showed up, for example, and said, hey, we'd like 30% of your revenues, the easiest thing would simply have been to roll over and say, sure, how would you like to get paid? But
Yeah.
we didn't do that, right? We stuck to our guns and we fought for what we believed. And I think that has had a tendency to work out for us over the years, not always equally so. And sometimes it does come back to hit you in the head. I think that's one of the reasons why lots of business people don't sort of always say what they think or do what they feel is right, because they have other considerations and things that they're afraid of will happen. And those things do happen occasionally. But yes, this principle of independence and the obligation to follow through on that independence and to do things that only we can do because of that independence is perhaps the number one value and principle we hold dear.
Thank you so much. How can we as product manager contribute to push on building more responsible products and against this type of agenda?
Yeah, I think it's often difficult. I think product management is often a discipline that's squeezed in between all sorts of other priorities, where good people will end up doing work that they're perhaps not eternally proud of because they have certain pressures from the business, from the stakeholders that are pushing them in directions that they know isn't right. You think often an example that's been pulled out a lot over the years is you think of how things have gone down at Facebook, for example. Like at every step of the way, when these social media platforms were being tinkered with and created, and the algorithms were tuned for maximum engagement and enragement, there were product managers at every step of the way. And I'm sure that those product managers, for the vast majority's case, are kind, caring people who want to do what's right in the world. But then suddenly you have the pressures of APIs and quarterly targets, and the mechanics of capitalism takes on a life of its own. And all of a sudden you are the person who you would have hated to be a year ago. And you still simply have to get up and do your job. And I find that that is in many ways, I almost have respect for the capacity of the cognitive dissonance that you have to keep inside your head to be in a role like that, because I know I am just personally utterly unsuited to be pressured in those ways. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why I knew early on in my career that I would make a very poor employee, because I simply couldn't keep my mouth shut and I couldn't march to a set of orders that were being put out if I didn't truly believe in them. So I think it is really difficult, but there are ways where we can sort of try and advocate and pull and nudge in the right direction. And I also think there are ways where, especially in a very strong job market, you can accept at some point, I can't do it. Like I've tried, I've given it a good go, but I can't pull the organization in the ethical direction that I'm trying to get it to. I'm going to go work somewhere else. But I think this is one of the things where perhaps previously I was more hardcore in that, and I've softened up in the idea that like, well, you could just quit your job. Well, that's easy to say in a lot of circumstances. Well, where else are you going to go? So you hop from Facebook to Twitter. Did life get any better? Did it get any more ethical? Are you working on anything that's furthering of humankind? I don't know. Maybe not. It's not actually always that easy to do. But I think having some set of personal principles that you believe in, and then cherry picking the ones that can actually make a difference at work. Everyone can have these small acts of rebellion to kind of pull the organization in the direction they hope for it to go. But yeah, I wish I had stronger, more encouraging, more inspiring advice. But I think the fact is that in the face of many large organizations, the individual is just an individual. And if that person is no longer there, then someone else will be, and life carries on. That's both a blessing and a curse. But yeah.
Thank you for that. The specialists and decision makers are trying to make privacy a concern. What would it take to change the public approach to privacy first products?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's just one of those questions that has been really exciting to me because things have actually changed. I've cared deeply about privacy my entire career, militantly so, on everything from encryption to what have you, to tracking, to spy pixels, to many of the things that we do at Basecamp and the products that we create are infused with this attention to privacy and this fight for greater privacy. And what I've observed in my time is that there's sort of like a before and after. And the before and after revolves around the passing of the GDPR. That this is one of those few moments in tech history where legislation actually changes the direction of the industry, at least on one side of the Atlantic. And today we have a whole category of companies that are born with a native appreciation for privacy because of the GDPR, because that is the law of the land in Europe. And it's a really interesting AB experiment because the GDPR only governs Europeans. It does not govern Americans, even though there are American legislators that are looking to the GDPR for inspiration. Broadly speaking, Europeans get the protection of the GDPR. And that means that all of these native companies that are born out of the GDPR, they're all European. One example that I often look to is plausible.io. Plausible.io is an alternative to Google Analytics, and it's born from this native understanding of the GDPR. We do not track individual user data. We aggregate things in a way that preserves that privacy. Therefore, we get to route around the requirements for consent and cookie banners and all the sort of perhaps less effective or meaningful legislations that's also been passed in Europe. I think that's also fair to point out that the precursor to the GDPR, this idea of the cookie banners, has in some ways become a scourge and has not actually solved or fixed anything, versus the GDPR core principles are actually strong and good and humanistic in this sense that can be woven into the DNA for company. And plausible.io is an example of this, where I think it's the kind of company that could only come out of Europe. You wouldn't see that from the US first. You look at all the US alternatives and they're all like, what do you mean privacy? Let's gather every piece of data we possibly can, store it all forever, and cross-reference it 25 times from here until we know everything about everyone all the time. And you go like, this is not the internet that I want to be part of. So I think that's been a really interesting note. And it's also provided cover. If you are now a company operating in Europe and you care about privacy, it's never been easier because the GDPR sort of sits there on the side, constantly providing at least an ideological backing for your push. Oh no, we can't actually do this. We can't just collect a bunch of email addresses and start sending people email unless we have informed consent. That it's enriched this vocabulary we have around privacy by giving up some core terms that product managers and other people work on product can invoke. And it has the strength of not just their opinion, but the letter of the law. And I think that that is sort of the idealized state of how legislation can actually help and advance technology. GDPR core principles, informed consent, defining what that means in terms that almost read like human rights declaration, is really powerful because I think it gives us something more than just laws. It gives us ambitions and aspirations that we're not just doing this because the law says something. We're doing this because it's right and it's good. This is one of the things I'm most proud of, that the European tech scene is starting to diverge. It's not just a poor, cheap copy of Silicon Valley. No, it's a set of companies trying to do something else, fundamentally different. I don't want the cheap copy of Twitter or Facebook or Amazon. That would be the worst outcome for the European tech scene, in my opinion, is that we just get these pale copies. We need completely different visions. And the GDPR for me is one of those cornerstones of that alternative universe where Europe goes first, and then hopefully America and the rest of the world is the one that follows along.
Very cool and inspiring. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I think the way to make people give a damn is to create products in that spirit, in that DNA, and make those products damn great. This is why I use Plausible as an example. Plausible is not just a more privacy-oriented version of Google Analytics. It's a better version of Google Analytics. So it competes not just like handicap with one hand behind its back in terms of what it can do, it does better. And I think nothing moves hearts and minds, like simply showing people what these principles and ideals can amount to in a practical sense that makes a real difference to someone's lives and inspires them in turn, right? I look at the approach that Plausible has taken on how they deal with data. And I think, do you know what? That gives me ideas. How should we manage things? How should we build our own internal system? Should we build them in that same spirit? And I think that this is the amazing power of role models, is that they light that sort of idea in someone's head that, do you know what? Maybe we could do this too. And I think that this is what we need more of. We need all of these new companies coming out of Europe in particular to embrace these European values of privacy and human rights in the broader context, and just make something that's the best. No more excuses, no more apologies. We have everything we need in Europe to create the kinds of products that would be the envy of the world anywhere, and does not have to say like, oh, well, it's because like we got started later or whatever. Embrace the fact that Europe was late to some extent, which means that you don't have to repeat all the same mistakes. You get to look at the internet culture that developed in the US and say, oh, there's some fine, great ideas, but there were also a lot of wrong turns. And we can take some different turns and we can come out with different kinds of products that feel natively European in a sense that is all those positive things about it. And I mean, obviously I have a great affiliation for Europe in general, but it's even more local than that too. I think to some extent we've oversold the value that the internet is kind of just this global community, as though that makes us all kind of just citizens of the world, which is a term I've actually used about myself in the past, but that I feel less and less an affiliation with, that we should not just be citizens of the world. We are citizens of a given place, and that given place informs our opinions and approaches to everything, including product development. And we should lean on that. When I think of the Danish companies that I'm particularly proud of, everything from Bang & Olufsen to Lego, I can see sort of these facets and strains of Danish culture. And I go like, you know what? The world is more interesting when out of the 186 countries around the world, we embrace those differences and we meet on the internet from that vantage point, that we don't all just create the same look, feel, approach, and set of values that govern everything, that focusing on the local aspects and embracing those and being proud of them enriches everyone. That the trade is more interesting when Denmark produces Danish products and Germany produces German products and the US produces American products. And then we kind of enrich that, right? I think technology used to have that feel. I remember sort of in the 80s, you'd be talking about like, oh, there was like Japanese technology. And that was a sort of a particular kind with a particular aesthetic. Or you'd go in the early days to Chen or some other place and you'd feel like it has a local vibe that is different and interesting. I think these days we've become more and more accustomed to the fact that there are these global platforms, but this idea that we had local platforms and we had local products and less of it had this sense of scale. This is the other thing that comes with the internet, that there is essentially no friction to scale. One American tech company could come to dominate the world in about 5 minutes. And we look at that with awe and say like, oh, isn't it wonderful? The internet breaks down borders. And you know what? I've come to see the flip side of that and go like, I don't think it's actually as wonderful as we perceived it to be. And I think we're in a great realignment right now. Some of that realignment is being provoked by things that aren't as nice and cuddly and cheery, like the Great Firewall in China. They're not these humanistic, open, happy-go-lucky values that we just talked about. But it kind of worked, as in China actually has a local strong tech scene with forms that are under sovereign control. And when you say sovereign, I mean, halfway single party dictatorship. Sovereign is perhaps not the greatest way of being under control, but you could recontextualize that and say, if we in Europe had sovereign control over the likes of the great media platforms from YouTube to Twitter to Facebook, wouldn't we be better off? I think we would.
All right. I think this is also interesting for our community, which are product managers. And at some point, a lot of decisions end up being principal decisions, or how do we envision this to be? Because then you can just go ahead and apply a playbook to optimize conversion or any other KPI you're looking at, right? So I think this is very exciting. So I will jump to one question. You have a fan of your speech from Rails conference 2019, where you spoke about free and open source software and the tragedy of the commons. Absolutely great principle. So what is the shift that you see in the FOSS community thinking since then?
Yeah, so what I've actually seen is almost like a fracture in the FOSS community in terms of the values that kind of are struggling to make themselves the predominant ones. One strain in the FOSS community is that open source software is currently a tragedy of the commons because there's not enough money being paid to individual contributors, and there's a lot of companies who are benefiting from this open source. And there's an impending catastrophe just around the corner if we don't rectify this problem. First of all, I think that analysis is simply wrong. It's been proven wrong by history. There's no catastrophe around the corner. This is simply, I think, a false pretext to push a narrative that open source needs to operate within the same capitalist dynamics as everything else. I have a different view on that. And that view is the appeal of open source to me is exactly because it does not operate within the normal capitalist dynamics. I get enough of the capitalist dynamics on a daily basis running a product company that is very much a capitalist company. And I enjoy that in many ways. And I think the world has much to be thankful for this basic version of capitalism. It also has many things to criticize about that world. But either way, having a space that is disconnected from the ethics and the principles of that world is like a refuge, at least to me. And when I work on open source, I don't work on it on capitalist terms. I work on it as a form of self-actualization and interest and productivity and creativity and things I just want to put out in the world, not because we're making transactions that I am giving you something and then you owe me something back. No, quite the contrary, that I am putting gifts out into this world with a little sticker on the side that says, enjoy this very much, but if you have problems, those are your problems. Do take care of them. They're not necessarily my problems. It doesn't mean we can't collaborate on solving them if I find them interesting too, but I don't owe you anything. And I think that that is just such a relief when you're used to being, as I am, otherwise a product person who sells services to customers where I do owe those customers something. When a customer signs up for Basecamp or Hey, I do have obligations I need to fulfill to those customers. And sometimes that's great and they're great customers. And other times it's less great and they're kind of less great customers, so to speak. I like the separation between these worlds.
All right. Thank you so much. So I'll move to remote work. What's your take on balancing remote work and maintaining good team bonds without making team activities excessive or too demanding?
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, we've been a remote company since inception. So for 20 plus years, I've worked remotely together with Jason and the other people at Basecamp. So for us, this was just life and has been life for 2 decades. So it was kind of interesting when in 2020, it became life and reality for everyone all at once, almost to the point that like I had to remind myself of like, oh yeah, there are still people who work in offices and they go to meetings in person all the time. And that's fascinating. I guess people can still work like that. I think this has been one of the challenging parts of the pandemic, and there's been many challenging parts, but one of them has been, okay, so we all have to do remote. That just means we have to install Zoom and Slack, right? That's how you do remote. You just install Zoom and Slack, and you carry on as you were and fill your day with Zoom meetings. And oh, what happens 2 weeks later? You absolutely hate your life. Oh, that's curious. Yeah, that doesn't work. The first tool of collaboration is writing, and writing that can be read 2 hours later or the next day and responded to asynchronously is a huge shift to make. Now, in terms of the culture, to make it sort of feel and fit with that, I think that is a difficult thing. And we've just been exposed to the most difficult circumstances. So all of our shared experience through this pandemic has been so heavily tainted by the fact that we were doing remote work while in isolation. when that's actually that's not the kind of remote work I've been doing. I've not been living in isolation for 20 years. I've had the opportunity to mix that remote collaboration with people who work around the world with seeing a bunch of people all the time in the flesh. Meeting and seeing each other face to face is incredibly important. It just doesn't have to happen every day or every week or even every month. That just having a chance to see and work and spend time and share meals with your coworkers once every 6 months is actually, in many cases, enough to provide that sort of strengthening of our fundamental human bonds. And then it's much easier after that to work together remotely. Now, even remotely, there's a million tactics you can use as well to sort of maintain those bonds and make sure that they don't decay too much between meeting up in person. We write about a bunch of it in Remote Office Not Required. It's a great little book you can read in about 2.5 hours that has a lot of this stuff on it. And then, of course, we built Basecamp for exactly this purpose. And we built the entire product around this idea of accommodating and encouraging and soothing and smoothing a remote organization with tools like automated check-ins. So, for example, we have a whole array of questions that Basecamp asks everyone who works at Basecamp every day or every week. Like, what have you worked on today? That's the replacement for status updates. Or the weekly question, what are you going to work on this week? That helps us coordinate and make those cross-cutting connections that people so romantically talk about. This is why we need the water cooler, or otherwise, how are you going to get the serendipitous communications and connections created? Well, you can actually also create those online if you use the right kinds of tools to do so. So those are some of the ideas.
All right. Thank you so much on that. I think part of what you said earlier with people having this forced experience, a lot of them have come to mention work-life balance. And I've noticed you have strong guardrails for that, as I remember emailing with you. And the reason why this event is not our usual schedules, because you had family obligations. So could you give people a few tips on how you protect your time while still being as efficient as you are running the company and also all the other activities that you do?
Yes. So this was actually one of the big themes in our latest book. It doesn't have to be crazy at work, about creating that separation and being able to achieve and accomplish, not in spite of it, but because of it. People often look at these kinds of separations as though they put on boundaries or limits or ceilings in terms of your ambitions. And if you were just more ambitious and would work those 60 or 70 or 80 hours a week, you could accomplish so much more. Absolutely bullshit. You think we're not accomplishing enough? You look at the history of Basecamp, the number of products we put out, the number of books we put out, the number of technology and open source we contributed to the greater ecosystem. I think anyone would be very hard pressed to say that we are not an ambitious company that is also highly productive. And I think we are highly productive exactly because we have these core principles about how much time is enough, that 40 hours a week is enough. 8 hours a day is enough. That even if you work 80 hours a week, that only gives you twice the number of hours. If you squander your hours, that's wasted anyway. So why don't we focus on making the hours we already have, the 8 hours a day, count for something more, which is where all of this integrates and kind of comes together in the sense that treating long stretches of uninterrupted time as a sacred KPI, if you will, to optimize. And when I think back upon all the breakthroughs that we've done as a company, that I've done as a person, they all fall within that. They never come from a 45-minute slice. They come from getting enough time to dive deep into a problem and realize, oh, here's where it lays, and then pushing through and solving it. And the other side of that is to realize that the time spent away from work is not unproductive time. It is the kind of broadening of your human perspective that allows you to be a better person, which in turn allows you to be a better worker. You don't become a better person just to become a better worker, but it's a consequence of it. And having sort of well-rested individuals who have other things going on in their life than just work, I think creates this kind of broad perspective that makes you a better decision maker. It makes you more in touch with your customers and with your product and with your own time, what's worth doing and what's not worth doing. It's funny that I often get the question, how do you get so much done? And I look at my day and like, I see many days, not always, but many days, I just see an empty calendar. And I go like, I don't feel like I'm stressed out. I don't feel like I'm doing that much. But it really does accumulate when you just keep getting these long stretches of uninterrupted time and solve core problem one after the other. It's not common for me to have a week where I look back upon that week on a Friday afternoon and think, actually, what did I get done? What moved forward? In fact, if I do that, and it does happen occasionally, it's always a sort of cause for great concern. But when I talk to other people, that's their life. This is what happens all the time. It's Friday afternoon and you look back upon your week and you think, actually, what did I do? And I think not only is this unproductive, it's also a source of great stress and dissatisfaction and draining of meaning. The reason we go to work as creative professionals is because we want to create and progress and improve. And how can we do that if we're not actually moving anything forward? So I think these things are intertwined and interlinked in the sense that if you are allowed the long stretches of uninterrupted time, if you're allowed the protections from interruptions and the freedom from pointless meetings, you will do more interesting work. And in turn, that interesting work will make you a happy, productive, satisfied worker and human. And like, isn't that what we're all trying to do and accomplish?
Cool. This is super interesting. Have the takeaway for ensuring long stretches of uninterrupted time and treating this also as a team KPI, as well for remote teams to meet every 6 months in person. Cool. Thank you so much for this.
Thanks again for having me and for putting this on.
Thank you for listening to this Product People podcast episode. To check the full conversation with video and to see the talks from other guests, head over to our YouTube page. The next episode will feature John Cutler, product evangelist at Amplitude. Make sure to follow our show on your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss it. See you next time.